Greetings everyone, I am Dr. J, and welcome to Through the Looking Glass, where I look at old games I haven't played before to see if they hold up. This time we're diving into a game with the longest title I've ever seen, so let's just spell it out. Star Wars Jedi Knight Dark Forces 2, and its expansion, Mysteries of the Sith. The Jedi Knight games are remembered fondly by many, as back in the day they came the closest to fulfilling the fantasy of being a Jedi. It didn't necessarily start out that way, as it first began with an innovative first-person shooter, but when you give an already badass character a lightsaber, then that's bound to be a recipe for success. Dark Forces 2 was the first official Jedi Knight game, and introduced with it plenty of force powers as well as more than its fair share of trouble for us to deal with. Given how much I heard about the Jedi Knight games, this was something I was more than looking forward to jump into. Before we get into the review proper, however, let's talk about a couple technical things. To start, you might have noticed that the UI has a tendency of flashing in and out of existence. This is not a problem with the game itself, but was an issue with either my recording software or operating system. So, as annoying as it might be now that you can't unsee it, bear in mind that that didn't happen in the actual game. Also, the music used for this game was the John Williams score used for the films, but since Lucasfilm is trigger happy about copyright regarding that, I'll be using the next best thing for ambience instead. So with that out of the way, was my excitement justified, or am I going to need to look further into the series to find out what everyone's been talking about? Let's find out. The story is the least important part, as per most FPS at the time, so let's start there. You reprise the role of Kyle Katarn roughly a year after the events of Return of the Jedi. The Empire's leadership may have technically fallen, but it seems like everyone and their mother is trying to use the pieces to cause the New Republic harm. In this case, while searching for information regarding his father's death, Kyle finds himself entangled with a matter regarding Jarek, a dark Jedi who is searching for clues to what is known as the Valley of the Jedi. It is said that a great power lies within it, meaning if Jarek manages to get his hands on it, then that's gonna be a bit of a problem for the New Republic. As part of this, Kyle also learns that he is force sensitive, and has a lot to figure out very quickly in order to find the Valley of the Jedi before Jarek, to say nothing of the other dark Jedi that will be standing in his way. The actual explanation to the plot is a little more complex than that, but for the sake of a basic summary, that should be enough to work with. On the whole, the plot is fairly solid, though there is a bit of weirdness when it comes to how Kyle is being trained. You see a Force Ghost at one point, but outside of some dialogue before fighting a Dark Jedi, you never really hear from him again, and it's somewhat implied that he's training you as you go, but we never get to see it. The story is also told through full motion video, which is both a blessing when it comes to the physical acting, and a curse whenever it involves the Star Trek original series level effects paired with it. Some of the acting is also a little hokey, but given the game genre and the time period, that's somewhat to be expected, and on the whole, the story itself has enough interesting turns to where I didn't mind so much. The fact that there are two endings depending on how you behave took me by surprise, as did a couple of other moments as well. The plot for Mysteries of the Sith, however, isn't quite as strong, as it seems to amble around a bit on what feel like side quests. It's set about 5 years later, and Kyle has found himself at a remote outpost training a little-known character by the name of Mara Jade. And to the non-Star Wars nerds in the audience, that was mostly sarcasm, as she plays an important role in the Legends continuity as the former Empire's hand-turned Jedi. If you want to know more, go read the Heir to the Empire trilogy. Either way, for the purpose of this story, you start out with Kyle as your base ends up being attacked and you need to evacuate, but once that's over, he goes off in search of something or other and you play Mara Jade for the rest of the adventure, doing various side missions before going off to look for Kyle when he doesn't report back. I won't go into detail as to what these side missions are, but they seem more like an excuse for gameplay because the premise of the expansion doesn't seem like it would have sustained the whole game. Though, given how the finale and build up towards it turns out, that may have been for the best, as while the stakes for the side missions weren't all that high, the game was still firing on all cylinders during them. Which brings us neatly into what the game has to offer visually and in terms of gameplay. Unfortunately, from a graphical standpoint, the game looks more than a little dated. Instead of using sprites as with the first game, now they're using full 3D models, which given the time period can end up being a recipe for disaster. Perhaps it's because of how ambitious they might have been, but there's a surprising amount of texture pop in as you get closer to a wall or object. I suspect they were dealing with more than their fair share of hardware limitations, but if that was the case, then would it have been better to stick with 2D sprites and wait until the technology was there? They managed to get enough detail packed in the game regardless, but when you then switch between FMV and gameplay, it can be a bit jarring. The expansion looks a bit better, especially since they don't use FMV and the locales are more interesting to look at, but it still has similar problems. When it comes to the audio, there are some places where it's a little too abrasive, but for the most part, the audio engineer did a good job. Every weapon and enemy sound distinct, and while the John Williams score doesn't always fit the circumstances well, it's still the John Williams score, and you won't hear any complaints from me over it. Where you will hear plenty of complaining, however, is when it comes to the gameplay, because, to put it kindly, it's a mixed bag. The gunplay is really nice, as while it's basic, the audio paired with the weapons and the feeling of impact when you fire them is really well done. For those of you who played the original Dark Forces, you'll be right at home since the weaponry and your health operates in the same manner as that game. Instead of only having a health bar, you have shields which absorb blaster fire and explosives, as well as a separate health bar which starts ticking down once your shields have been weakened enough. However, melee hits will bypass your shield and hurt you directly, which makes melee combat a lot more intense than it would be otherwise. Most weapons fall into two different types, with both types having a shared ammo pool. Your Stormtrooper blaster and sidearm use one pool, while every other energy weapon pulls from a different one. Since that the other weapons are generally more powerful and more accurate, that means it becomes a trade-off on using what is effectively premium ammo to take down opponents quickly, versus taking less accurate or powerful weapons and needing to be more cautious. Beyond this, there are other trade-offs to be made as well, since some weapons do have their own ammo reserved for them, such as for the thermal detonators and rocket launcher. And yes, there is a rocket launcher, and when you don't have enough ammo for the Trandoshan rifle, it is really satisfying to use for all of your AoE needs. I found that I was accidentally hitting the wall or floor more than I probably should have, but that could be maybe chalked up to my resolution or field of view. Where the combat falls flat for me is when it comes to the lightsaber and force powers. Again, maybe because of my resolution, using the lightsaber effectively was more difficult than it should have been. Technically speaking, Kyle and Mara Jade will deflect ranged attacks that they can see, except that doesn't always seem to happen. To actually hit someone, it feels like you have to practically hug them to get close enough, and by then they're probably trying to teach you a lesson on how no means no with a nice hit to the face. This makes any sort of melee fight really unsatisfying, as it becomes a matter of exploiting the brain-dead AI by literally running circles around them, in the hopes that you can hit them before they hit you. There's very little nuance or skill associated with any confrontation against the Dark Jedi, or any creature that can use melee for that matter, which we'll get to in a moment. As for the force powers, there is a good variety to them, ranging from improved movement to offensive attacks to passive buffs and debuffs and so on and so forth. The problem with these is that switching between them can be difficult even after you've messed with the hotkeys a little bit. Having to manage weaponry on the number keys, with items, force powers, and game options all being shoved onto the F keys, means you end up spamming a rotating button in the hopes of getting to the power you want, which isn't necessarily useful when you're in the middle of a firefight. It also doesn't help that a lot of them are passive effects, with the active ones being finicky to use properly at the best of times. You would think Saber Throw would be a lot more fun to use than it actually is, because not only do you not have something to deflect blaster fire with, you have to sometimes run after your weapon if you're careless, all the while hoping that the throw actually did something useful. And don't even get me started on how some of the powers seem artificially locked away so that we don't spam them. If you didn't want me to use my force powers every chance I get, at least give me a better indicator as to when I'll get them back, especially when you don't make it clear that the reddish whatever it is below the ammo indicator is a more general meter. So in terms of combat, the aspects that were added by virtue of being a Jedi don't really add all that much, and at the worst of times end up being a hindrance. Thankfully, the shooting aspect was still solid, even if the AI wasn't necessarily all that smart. However, as with most shooters, the combat is only half the battle, as it were, as the level design is also vitally important. And again, when it comes to the combat, the pacing is fairly good. In many ways, the level design feels like the progenitor to Half-Life, as while it's a lot more linear than a classic FPS, it's well paced, there's a decent amount of variety, and if you go off the beaten path, there are still plenty of secrets to find. In fact, there's almost too much to find in some places, but outside of one or two situations, it never felt like a slog so long as I knew where I was going. Unfortunately, that qualifying statement is where the game began to unravel for me. Thus far, I have attempted to remain level-headed when talking about this, mostly because the problems I have with the combat are ones that didn't appear all that often, at least when I started out. You can go back and see a video I made talking about my first impressions of the game, and for the most part, I liked what I was seeing. The problem was that I had no idea how obtuse the game was going to get later down the road, to where a literal maze-like level from the original Dark Forces was easier to understand than the linear levels I was given here. Granted, it isn't obtuse all the time, but there were multiple points where I was going back and forth over and over, combing the level for the one switch I missed, or the one key I needed, or the one tiny detail that I had overlooked, just to get on with what I was enjoying the most about the game. I absolutely despise looking up guides in order to get through a game, as in principle I like to believe that a game should be good enough that even if it takes me some time to figure out what to do, there is a way to figure that out and I will eventually get there. That was not the case for this game, as through both the base game and expansion, there were multiple points where I was completely stumped, frustrated, and just wanting to move on without even the slightest clue as to where the last thing I needed was. Sometimes it was something obvious and I was being stupid, other times it was something that I would have never noticed if someone hadn't told me to look there. What makes this ironically worse, however, are the force powers. Because they exist, that means we can rely on them for certain sections in order to progress, at least in theory. However, because this creates options to move around the map in ways you wouldn't have otherwise, I found myself wasting time moving through what I thought was the way forward by using the force jump or force speed, only to realize after I was frustrated that I was actually supposed to go a different way. And that's not even going into how difficult it is to make force jump work with you, because not only does it have a charge up before you can use it, moving through some doorways is an exercise in frustration even when you discount force powers, as if the doorway is raised even slightly too high, then you literally have to back up to make the jump work, because apparently we're going to overcompensate for the sake of using momentum for actual jumps, which don't even work all that well to begin with. Even with that, however, I would have difficulty recommending the game, but could still do so because of the fun combat and good pacing. If it weren't for all of the issues I've mentioned culminating in what might be the worst levels I've played in a long time. The ending to Mysteries of the Sith is almost enough for me to say you should ignore the expansion entirely, because holy crap, I have not been this frustrated at a game in a long time, and that's despite playing that section of Undertale recently. Over 2 hours on a single boss fight when I know I'm the one being awful and it's designed to be hard, I can live with that. But when it feels like nothing I do works properly, but needs to in order to actually progress, when I'm given so little to work with, to where when it doesn't work I have so little room to maneuver, it's a very good thing I wasn't recording live because I might have destroyed the salt industry in one video. Not only do they force you to use the lightsaber, which is the weakest part of the combat, they pit you against enemies that are either so quick that you have to thread the needle, or will kill you in 2 seconds flat when you make a mistake, or both. The final boss fight of the base game was literally easier to deal with than those enemies were, not because they were difficult, but because they were unfair. And that's to say nothing about how you're having to fight a decent amount in the water as well, which means you get to deal with all the fun stuff I haven't even mentioned when it comes to water combat, because you know what's a good idea? Binding the button that you use to go up in the water to the same button you use to jump, because that won't make it extremely difficult to get out of the water, especially when there's a very angry creature tailing you. Also, don't worry about any of the annoying acrobatics or the fact that they introduced Salamiri to make that wonderful foresight that you can use to anticipate how frustrating the next session will be absolutely useless. Because who doesn't love to fly blind into danger that could easily two-shot you without a second thought? In case it isn't obvious yet, those last few levels completely destroyed any goodwill I had for this game, to a degree where I'm finding it difficult to recommend. When push comes to shove, it did not age well. While the gunplay is satisfying and the weapon variety is decent, the AI is brain dead and the lightsaber is finicky at best. While the level design is good with respect to pacing, actually getting through the levels is a nightmare of scouring an area in hopes of finding the one clue that might actually allow you to move on. And while the story itself wasn't awful or poorly told, the final section of Mysteries of the Sith alone was so frustrating that I considered cheating to get through it. As much as I wanted to like it and as good as the first impression was, I simply can't recommend it due to all of the problems it has, unless you're a diehard Star Wars fan. And even then, I would point you to the original Dark Forces or Knights of the Old Republic way before I point you to this. And even if you do want to check it out despite my warning, getting this thing to work took me more time than it should have. If you have the Steam version, then you're going to have a bad time no matter what, as you literally have to delete files within the game's directory to make it work. Even then, you're still running into issues that will prevent you from hearing most of the ambient music, as well as going into 1080p, though given that all they do is chop off the top and bottom of the screen, maybe that isn't such a bad thing. And don't worry if you have the GOG version, because if you have the fortunate displeasure of using Windows 10, you'll get to deal with both of these issues as well, though you won't have to tamper with the game itself to get it to that state. So yeah, I think I've given people more than enough reason to dislike me as much as I dislike this game, so regardless of whether that's true, thank you for watching either way. Please like and share this if you find it deserving, and subscribe to this channel for hopefully less angry rants as well as other content posted on a pseudo-regular basis. Okay, deep breaths, you can calm down now. Don't worry about Jedi Outcast for a while, just go do something else, specifically something not quite as rage-inducing. Maybe I can find something a little more therapeutic with the next one, try and relax a little bit more. Either way, I'm gonna dig through my shortlist and see if a game like that is on there, and we'll see you all later.